We turned the corner and there was a vampire. I groaned and rolled my eyes. This is how the foreword to Curse of Strahd begins, with Tracy Hickman recalling one of his first forays into Dungeons & Dragons in 1978. Hickman described a game that consisted of a hodgepodge of rooms, traps, treasures, and monsters. And at random encounter number 34, a vampire. Not a vampire with a capital V, but a so many hit dice with such and such an armor class, lowercase vampire. Just another monster in the dungeon. Hickman continues to explain that, after witnessing the menagerie of unremarkable monsters, Hickman wanted to make something special. That was when Strahd von Zarovich was born. The iconic Strahd is a very popular character, but much of the discourse surrounding him are DMs having trouble with his characterization, struggling to consolidate his themes and goals, which is why in this video we're going to put a spotlight on the literary archetypes of Strahd, in hopes it helps everyone have a better grasp of his character. Many of you will know that Strahd was an invention of authors Tracy and Laura Hickman, who would have their module that featured him, Ravenloft, published in 1983. Strahd became widely regarded as one of the most iconic villains in Dungeons & Dragons, owing to his adventure's immense popularity, and at that time, somewhat novel way in which it featured an interesting villain with a compelling backstory. To create Strahd, the Hickmans hit the books and film, beginning with the image of the titular Dracula from the classic 1931 film. Their research would extend to Bram Stoker's Dracula novel and John William Polidori's The Vampire. The resultant Strahd was the prototypical vampire, moody and brooding, and oh so much the child of Dracula. Tracy Hickman explained, Strahd came directly from the roots of vampire lore, the origins of the modern vampire spring from the feminine cautionary tales warning women away from the Bluebeard archetype. The Bluebeard archetype that Hickman here refers to is one of a wealthy man who is a serial murderer of his wives. The stories typically involve the new bride discovering the monstrous nature of Bluebeard and his secret past of matricide. The bride then attempts to survive and escape, typically with the help of good-natured side characters, and often ends with the woman being empowered in some way. Contemporary versions of the Bluebeard story come in Guillermo del Toro's Crimson Peak that offers a classic view with a twist, and Alex Garland's Ex Machina that offers a more modern take with an AI robot. It's more clever than I just made it sound. Strahd is obviously a Bluebeard, with Tatiana in her reincarnations as a repeated victim, and the adventuring party as the good-natured side characters. We'll talk more about that in a bit. While I was unable to find any stories involving a Bluebeard who is specifically a vampire, the themes are a natural fit, and it's easy to see what the Hickmans wanted to say with Strahd. He is constructed as a serial abuser, hidden by a suave veneer. Strahd was someone who could not be redeemed by love. He is the lie that it's okay to enter into a romance with an abusive monster, because if you love it enough, it will change. Strahd is written as an allegory for the cycle of abuse and the nature of the serial abuser. Indeed, there is certainly plenty of Bluebeard in Strahd, which will help you formulate a persona of Strahd for you to leverage in your game. However, there's another prominent literary theme that's present within Strahd that often goes unmentioned in this conversation. One that Strahd, and every other contemporary vampire for that matter, owes their conception to much more than the Bluebeard.
Rise now, ye white whale. Show us your crooked jaw. Show us your wrinkled brow.
1,000 a year, and he owns half of Derbyshire.
The miserable half.
And a ride home.
This is Ames, mister.
The roots of Strahd and other contemporary vampires lie in the romantic hero archetype. The romantic hero, of course, appears in romantic literature during the movement of the 18th and 19th centuries. Romantic stories deal in overt emotion, embracing nature and adventure, among other themes. The romantic hero would typically serve as the protagonist, who would be some kind of exceptional individual, and much of the story would be concerned with their inner turmoil and self-actualization. Some examples would include Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice, Captain Ahab in Moby Dick, and Ponyboy in The Outsiders. A popular author of romantic literature was George Byron, better known as Lord Byron. Byron's heroes tended to have certain qualities. Peter Thorslev put them as borrowed characteristics from the Gothic villain in his looks, his mysterious past, and his secret sins, and has retained characteristics from the Man of Feeling in his tender sensibilities and his undying fidelity to the woman he loves. But he is more than these. He is also a romantic rebel. Lord Byron himself had, perhaps unwillingly, an intimate connection with his heroes as the public projected his characters onto Byron himself. Lord Byron's public image would be one of both celebrity and scandal. He was forced into self-exile after several accusations of impropriety, such as incest and homosexuality. This image was not helped with accounts of Byron suffering agonies upon his loved ones, just as his character did. The Byronic hero, like Lord Byron himself, is an outcast, simultaneously victim and victimizer. As Conrad Aquilina would put it, The Byronic hero bears the doll markings of both villain and victim. He's a fallen creature in his own right, a dark angel bringing both love and death, yearning for redemption and ultimately finding none. In other words, the Byronic hero is a complex and often contradictory character that embodies the romantic ideal of the individual as a complex and tortured soul in search of meaning and identity. This ideal was seized upon by John William Polidori when he penned The Vampire. Polidori was an apparent rival to Byron and purportedly penned The Vampire with Byron in mind. Within this story, the titular vampire, Lord Ruthven, is a charming yet sinister aristocrat who secretly preys on the innocent. He manipulates and corrupts those around him, leaving destruction in his wake. The Vampire in Polidori's story is a satirical and critical take on Byron and his Byronic heroes, and yet thus, the literary vampire was born. This seminal work of Polidori's set the stage for the signature traits of the Byronic hero to become vampire mythos. Many more stories would contain vampires in this mold, each author expanding upon the mythos in their own way. Reclusiveness turns into weakness to sunlight, preternatural charisma turns into supernatural charm, and the self-destructive behavior in dark past becomes lethal. Before the advent of the Byronic vampire, vampire stories were mostly monster tales of ghouls and ghosts. Now, vampires were a member of society, notably nobility, exploiting and preying upon others in a masochistic game. The transition from the Byronic hero to the Byronic vampire was a natural one, as both archetypes explore themes of alienation, rebellion, and the complexities of the human or inhuman condition. Thus, the Byronic vampire became a staple in Gothic and horror literature. From folklore to Byron and Polidori, to Dracula and Bluebeard, and finally to Strahd. I hope the lineage of Strahd's character is clear. To further elucidate, let's turn to the Curse of Strahd and what is written about Strahd's history, while keeping the previous explanation of Byronic hero in mind, and pointing out which elements can help you for your characterization of Strahd. So Strahd was a warlord who carved out his dominion in the Valley of Barovia. After his father's death, and his age crept upon him, he struck a dark pact for immortality. In the cold halls of Castle Ravenloft, named for his deceased mother, Strahd's heart was captured by Tatiana. Yet her love belonged to his younger brother, Sergei. Consumed by envy, Strahd murdered Sergei on their wedding day, only to watch in despair as Tatiana chose death to escape Strahd. In that moment, Strahd's pact took hold, transforming him to a vampire, and cursing him to an eternal, tormented existence, forever bound by the mist-enshrouded land of Barovia, where love and peace would always elude him. And that may have been a romantic reading of his tale, but that's kind of the point, isn't it? This is a romantic and Gothic tale. So let's discuss. Strahd is a war-hardened prince and conqueror who, despite his successes, feels his best years slipping away. His pact with the dark power stems from a deep-seated fear of aging and death and his attempt to defy fate and mortality, a common theme among Byronic heroes who often rebel against divine or moral laws. This pact transforms him into a vampire, granting him immortality but at the cost of his humanity and soul, or what was left of it. Strahd's sense of isolation begins with his strained relationship with his family, particularly his envy of his younger brother, Sergei, and his mother, who feared him after he became cold during his conquests, likely becoming all too comfortable with dealing out death. His choice to remain in Barovia, combined with the tragic death of his mother, deepens his loneliness, a key trait of the Byronic figure. Strahd's obsession with Tatiana, who represents a chance for love and redemption, leads him to murder his brother Sergei in a fit of jealousy. His inability to win Tatiana's love, despite his efforts, highlights the theme of unattainable desire, which often drives Byronic characters to their downfall. After Tatiana's death and his own transformation, Strahd is condemned to an eternity of undeath, locked within the cursed domain of Barovia. His story is marked by eternal torment, guilt, and the relentless pursuit of love he can never have, hallmarks of the Byronic vampire archetype. Strahd's complexity as a villain comes from his internal conflict and the tragic nature of his existence. He is not merely evil, he is a deeply flawed character, driven by love, envy, and pride. His vampiric nature makes him both a predator and a prisoner of his own desires, embodying the duality that defines the Byronic vampire. Strahd's eternal suffering is central to his romantic nature. He is a character who seeks redemption in love, but his actions have damned him to an existence where these are forever out of reach. This eternal longing, coupled with the realization that he is the architect of his own misery, is deeply romantic in its tragedy. If you are like me, examples from familiar media can further help nail down a character or theme, so let's discuss some of them here. Now, of course, you can simply consume media such as The Vampire, Dracula, or Interview with a Vampire, but I would like to use a little less on-the-nose examples, ones that are not overshadowed by the whole vampire thing. The first is a story that has some striking similarities with Curse of Strahd, including a problematic depiction of Romani people and other marginalized groups, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Now, the 1996 Disney film will suffice as an example, recognizing it is much tamer than its source material, and you can obviously get through it much faster. Our Strahd in this story is the main villain, Claude Frollo. Frollo's tragic rags-to-riches story, his adoption of Quasimodo, and piety makes him a character worthy of admiration, a hero in another story. His isolation, passion, and inner turmoil mark him as Byronic, and his absolutely insane actions in his pursuit of Esmeralda obviously mark him as the villain. Our second example is everybody's favorite drug dealer, Walter White from Breaking Bad. White is prodigious in his chemistry work and tragically lost his father at the early age of 6. Fast forward, and White is a high school chem teacher, feeling unfulfilled with his uninterested students, and a company he formerly founded and subsequently left has become very successful. This is a setup to White's tragic backstory, prodigious nature, and inner turmoil that mark him as Byronic. Throughout the show, White is shown to descend from tragic hero to a Bluebeard villain, inflicting harms and abuse on those around him. For a third example, I have a character that doesn't quite match the Byronic Bluebeard mold that I've been establishing here. It's much more a practical example of how a Byronic Bluebeard might act towards your party, and that's Hans Landa, portrayed by Christoph Waltz in Inglourious Basterds. Waltz's performance in this film is a perfect example of the abuser, the homicidal monster, hidden behind charm, intelligence, and polite society. And I'll leave you with this thought about Strahd, who eternally pursues his unrequited love, Tatiana, at the expense of her and those around her, including his own brother Sergei, causing both of their deaths. Strahd created a pact with the dark powers, trapping him in Barovia, where he's forever tormented by Tatiana's continuous reincarnation. The tragedy surrounding Strahd can be sympathetic, but it is of his own making. Strahd can force others within his domain to love him, but he wants to be wanted. He is a contradiction. He truly is the dark angel bringing both love and death. The Byronic Strahd is the suave and charming abuser, and the Bluebeard Strahd is the homicidal monster. Which mask he chooses to wear at any given scene is up to you.